Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Tensie Whelan with us today. Professor Tensie Whelan is the Distinguished Professor of Practice for Business and Society and the founding director of the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. With over 25 years of experience in local, national, and international sustainability issues, Professor Tensie is dedicated to advancing the proactive and innovative mainstreaming of sustainability within businesses. As president of the Rainforest Alliance, Professor Tensie grew the organization's budget from $4.5 million to $50 million and recruited over 5,000 companies across more than 60 countries to engage in sustainability practices. Under her leadership, the Rainforest Alliance became an internationally recognized and credible brand. Prior to this, Professor Tensie served as Executive Director of the New York League of Conservation Waters, Vice President of the National Audubon Society, Managing Editor of MBO, a journal of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, and as a journalist in Latin America. Professor Tensie has been recognized by Ethisphere as one of the 100 most influential people in business ethics. She was also a City Fellow in Leadership and Ethics at NYU Stern and has served on numerous non-profit boards. She currently sits on the advisory board of ALO Advisors, Edelman, Giant Ventures, and Nespresso. She was recently appointed to the board of Emerald Spark and is an advisor to the Future Economy Project for Harvard Business Review. Professor Tensie holds a BA from New York University and MA from American University and is a graduate of the Harvard Business School Honor President Management Program. She was awarded the Stern Faculty Excellence Award in 2020 and named Distinguished Professor of Practice in 2023 in recognition of her outstanding contributions to Stern and the field of sustainable business. In this episode, Professor Tensie Whelan offers valuable insights from her research, Bridging the ESG Gap, How Boards Are Evolving. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tensie Whelan to our podcast, where we look forward to gaining valuable insights from her expertise on the topic. It's a genuine pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Tensie Whelan.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And also for you and our listeners, my name is a challenging one. It's pronounced Tensie, so think of it as an O. But otherwise, I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Professor, can you explain the historical challenges faced by US public boards in addressing ESG issues and what has prompted the shift over the past 5 years?
We've been looking at what the ESG credentials of board members are starting back in 2018. We saw back in 2018 that relatively few board members of the 1,188 Fortune 100 board members, for example, only 6% had environmental credentials, only 6% had governance credentials. A few more had social credentials. That was the biggest group. But still pretty modest. We also saw that very few had ESG committees at the time. So when we looked at this more recently in 2023, we saw that, in fact, the percentage of board members with ESG credentials had grown from 29% in total to 43%. And in fact, environmental credentials doubled to 12%, governance credentials increased to 15%. So real progress. Why do we have that progress? I think because for two reasons. One is that boards and executive leadership are beginning to understand that sustainability is actually a business imperative. It's strategic and important for the company's business strategy and for its financial performance. So some boards, not all, are beginning to understand that. In addition, there's an enormous amount of regulation and compliance that organizations are now responsible for, particularly in the EU, but all around the world. And that means that boards need to make sure that their executive team is complying with that law and therefore need to understand to a certain extent what those issues are, how they're complying with them, and how they're reporting on them. So both from a reporting and compliance and a strategic perspective, I think boards are getting more involved.
The research highlights a significant rise in the percentage of Fortune 100 board members with relevant ESG credentials. So what do you think has been driving force behind this improvement, particularly in environmental and governance expertise?
Well, so for example, back in 2018, only 3 board members out of 1,188 had climate credentials. This is despite the fact that many of the Fortune 100 companies include companies with lots of exposure to climate change. They include property and casualty insurance companies. They include consumer packaged goods companies whose supply chains are being disrupted by climate change. They include utilities who clearly have an impact on the climate and are experiencing, as we saw in California here, for example, our utility there, the forest fires destroyed their ability to provide electricity and so on. So we have climate as one example is a very material issue, but back in 2018, only 3 board members with credentials. Today, it's 22. That is still, I mean, it's better. It's still very low. And again, when you look at some of these utilities, for example, utilities actually have the lowest rate of ESG board credentials of any kind of industry group, and they don't have anybody with climate on their board. So it remains a real issue. Even a topic like cybersecurity, which is important on the G, right, for companies, we saw back in 2018, only 8 board members had credentials. Today, it's accelerated to 50. But again, you look at some companies with, a big part of their value proposition is the information they collect and manage for consumers or citizens. And if they don't have anybody who understands cybersecurity, that's a huge reputational and regulatory blind spot potentially for them. The other area, well, I think you're going to go into some of the other areas, but so I think why are we seeing this growth in credentials? Well, the other thing that's interesting is that until recently, there was an effort to get more women on boards in the US. Now we've got a backlash to that, unfortunately, but women were very much underrepresented. What we've seen is on the Fortune 100 is a significant increase in the percentage of women on boards, and they tend to have more ESG credentials than the men. So as they've come on the board, they've also brought their ESG credentials with them. Again, there's men with ESG credentials too, of course, but that has also been an interesting development here. And the one other thing I would point out is that I saw boards tend to have investors on the boards, right? Because they want to understand and get advice around what investor relations should be thinking about. And one of the things that I was curious about back in 2018 is how few ESG or impact investors were on these boards. I think it was 5% back then. Now it's up to 15%. So again, we see like significant growth in that area, which to me is a really obvious one because there's so many investors now paying attention to these issues.
Professor, despite the overall progress, climate change expertise remains a major gap. Why do you think that is, and what steps can boards take to better equip themselves in understanding the implications of climate change on business strategy?
I think the challenges that most boards and many of their executive leadership teams do not really understand the risk that climate provides to them or the opportunity that climate provides. So there's a major commodity company on the Fortune 100. They have nobody on their board with any engagement around climate, yet the commodities that they manage, agriculture commodities, mining commodities, all are both affected by climate change and generate emissions. So they have double materiality in a way. And yet that company, and I would say that company some years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, had to sell off a bit of their business because of major weather impacts on their business. But nobody there is focused on this, right? So that's a strategic miss for the company. And I think what we see over and over again is companies again not sort of thinking of this as like a compliance and reporting issue as opposed to a really integral issue for them to manage. Not every single industry has huge climate exposure, but most do. And when you look at the Fortune 100 or you look at the sort of industry verticals, again, 80% of those verticals are going to be pretty significantly and already are affected by climate. The other thing that I think boards don't understand if they're in the manufacturing space, there's an enormous amount of embedded carbon and water, et cetera, in any manufacturing process. There's an enormous operational efficiency to be had by decarbonization, reducing your water use. Boards don't really understand this, neither do the executive leadership. So there's a lot of lack of understanding of its strategic and financial benefit, which I think we need to address both with the executive leadership teams and the boards.
Issues like worker welfare seem to have lagged behind in terms of board expertise. Why
Yeah.
is this area less developed, and what might be the barriers preventing more boards from prioritizing these issues?
Well, the first thing, the good news is that the social category is the biggest in terms of board credentials, and a really significant number of them are related to diversity, equity, inclusion. So we have, to write this down because I don't remember. Oh, yeah, we went from 60 board members who had DEI credentials to 108 in those 5 years. So a big focus on that, which is important. And this are things like, board members who are active in Black business leadership or board members that are active in helping women become, leaders, et cetera. So that's positive. The big miss, and this is really a US company problem. There are other countries with this problem too, but for example, I think Europe has less of this problem. US companies do not have people who represent worker voice on their boards. They might have occasionally somebody from HR, but HR's job is to protect the company, not really so much to protect the employees, right? So, certainly there's some advice and perspective they can provide, but it's more at an employee relations level and not at kind of particularly a frontline worker perspective. And I think that stems out of our I would say management's approach to labor, which is like, let's figure out how to minimize it and reduce it and offshore it and do whatever we can to reduce our costs, as opposed to thinking of your labor as the thing that is going to make your company succeed. Our accounting systems, for example, say that investments in training for workers is a cost. But if the point of the training is to have the workers be more productive so they can generate more income for the company, why is investing in training a cost? It should be an investment. Why do we depreciate robots? So it's beneficial to buy robots, but we don't depreciate people, obviously. So it's more economic to invest in robots because you can depreciate them. So, there's like a whole series of accounting decision making, also our focus on short-termism, on improving our margins as much as possible without really understanding that actually, if you don't treat your frontline workers well, you have low customer satisfaction, you have high turnover, which, and sort of poor retention, which is expensive to keep, replacing these people. And if they're in a bad mood, they're not treating the customers well, and so on and so forth. So I think a series of issues that in America we do not pay sufficient attention to, and that I think is part of the reason why we have this populist new administration, right? And so it's a huge blind spot for boards, and particularly those that have that kind of a dynamic where they have factory workers or frontline workers. They should be having one person, like not half the board, but they should have somebody who can really speak and understands that experience and can provide good strategic insights.
Professor, the creation of dedicated ESG or sustainability committees has surged in recent years. What role do these committees play in improving ESG oversight? And do you think this model could become the norm across all large companies?
Yeah, so again, in this research we did for the Fortune 100, we saw they went from 22 ESG committees in 2018 to 89, so almost every company in 2023. We also see companies without ESG committees, but are putting ESG responsibilities into the charters of other committees. But let's talk first about ESG or sustainability committees. By the way, I think ESG, as an aside, ESG one of the reasons I think why we have some challenges with the term is that ESG was initially meant by the UN to be a way of measuring progress on sustainability. So sustainability is about environment, social, and governance and profitability. ESG does not include profitability, which is why one of the reasons why it's been criticized. But also, it wasn't meant to be a strategy. It was just meant to be a set of metrics. So when I think about a committee, I would prefer that companies call them sustainability committees, and that they're maybe managing for some ESG metrics in those committees, because I want them to understand that sustainability actually drives profitability as well as better societal impact. Anyway, why have a sustainability committee? Because if you only have sustainability slash ESG in, for example, your audit committee, where you might look at the compliance issue, you're not approaching it from strategic or value creation perspective. If you put it solely into nominating, then you're looking really mainly at just sort of the education and credentials of the board member, which is also important, but doesn't help you with understanding the strategy and the financial performance. The other place you can see it is in comp, but again, tying ESG comp to or tying compensation to performance on ESG targets or sustainability targets is a great thing. But again, it doesn't get to the broader strategic questions. So having, and then the final way that companies approach it is to say, well, we don't need a committee. We're just going to govern it as the whole of the board. But when you govern it as the whole of the board, it's like, if everyone's in charge, who's in charge? And so what happens then is you don't dedicate enough time to the topics. So a sustainability committee really can focus in on understanding the material risks and opportunities for the business strategy of the company. So how does climate change affect it? How does worker welfare affect it? How does water affect it? And with that understanding, not only of the risks, but also, hey, our customers are asking for these kinds of innovations related to sustainability. What are we doing about that, right? So really understanding those risks and opportunities and the benefits for the strategy and the value creation elements, I think, are critical for boards to make sure that the capital allocation is there to move ahead with some of these very capital intensive transformations that are needed. As well as making sure that the board members are honoring their fiduciary duty by making sure that their leadership, in fact, are managing for these material risks and opportunities in the most effective way possible.
With increasing regulatory pressures around ESG, how should boards be preparing for these changes? And where do you see strategic opportunities for companies in embracing a low carbon economy?
Well, on the reporting and compliance side, I think they should make sure that their company, and this is for the larger companies, has a good reporting software, that ideally it's tied back into the other reporting systems. So you have integrated reporting systems, your financial, your risk, et cetera, and now your ESG, and also potentially carbon accounting, which we'll come back to. There are a number of organizations that do that. I'm an advisor to Workiva that does that. SAP does. There's enormous number of kind of platforms out there that can provide that. And I think it's important because it helps professionalize the information data collection and be consistent. And they have in there, the specifics around how do you comply with CSRD, or how do you comply, which is the European Union sustainability requirements, which affect non-European companies who do business there. How do you address ISSB, SASB requirements, which increasingly around the world, we're seeing different countries require those, as well as investors and brands. So I think really important that the board understand these different compliance frameworks and support the organization in managing their reporting well. But they should not allow, and this is where the sustainability committee comes in, they should not allow the company to manage to ESG reporting metrics, because ESG reporting metrics are process-based and output-based. In other words, in the apparel, let's say you're in the apparel sector, the criteria, the metrics are, have you looked at chemicals is obviously a material issue for that sector. And the metric is something like, have you looked at the chemicals that you use? It doesn't require you to actually tell you what they are, to reduce them, to substitute for them, none of that, right? So you can like get a check by just saying, yeah, I've looked at so therefore you'd be treated the same as a company that's developed a bio-based dye that reduces energy costs, chemical cost, wastewater treatment costs, and creates competitive advantage because buyers want it. That would be treated the same in these reporting metrics, but only one of those creates strategic value. So this is why, again, the board needs to understand these issues beyond the reporting and compliance element. And that goes to, you asked about the low carbon economy. Companies can treat this as a reporting exercise. Let me just understand my scope 1 and 2, and if I have to, my scope 3, and report out on it. Or they can say, well, actually, if I reduce my greenhouse gas emissions, I create operational efficiencies because I reduce my energy costs. I reduce my regulatory costs because increasingly, like EU, we've got carbon border adjustment tax, we've got carbon fees around the world, et cetera. I reduce my reputational risk because if I have a really problematic carbon profile, my customers may begin to move away from me, right? So a whole series of benefits strategically of pursuing a decarbonization strategy. Another benefit is like, we're going to see energy pricing get much more volatile. And if you reduce your need for that amount of energy, then you also reduce volatility. Yeah. So there's just a whole series of benefits that the boards need to understand. If they're in a B2B business that services brands who've made decarbonization commitments, then coming up with solutions for like Workiva and SAP have in terms of these reporting platforms, or BASF has in terms of manufacturing, creating products that can reduce the carbon load of a particular manufacturing process, or Schneider's partnering with their suppliers to help them decarbonize, providing them loans to do that, right? All these opportunities to actually go in and support this can actually build business for you as well. So it's both managing risk, reducing operation or improving operational efficiency, having cost savings, and also creating upside business opportunities around solutions and services that you create.
How does having board members with strong ESG credentials impact company performance, both in terms of long-term sustainability and short-term financial results?
There's no research out there that looks at that correlation. So I will just tell you my opinion as opposed to say have the data behind this. But as with any topic, anything from marketing, good, strong marketing strategies to cybersecurity to climate, if the board member's job is to ask the right questions, to make sure that executive leadership is thinking about the right things because they're so close to it. The role of the board is to pull a step back and say, well, great, what about this, right? Have you looked at how, the extreme weather is affecting our business as we look out over the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because management is in their day-to-day kind of mind frame. So, but if the board doesn't have enough background to know to ask the right questions, then they have blind spots around the company's strategy and financial performance, which could end up being very, very problematic for them. So, if, for example, a property and casualty insurance company does not disclose in its 10K, which is its SEC, our Securities Exchange Commission reporting, right? And it's supposed to disclose there any material risks for investors to understand. If they don't disclose what are material risks that could really affect their business, which are known about, I mean, obviously there are things that come up that you don't know about, you're liable. The board is liable, the CFO is liable, and so on. So if the board, if a property casualty insurance company insuring buildings in Florida is not reporting in their legally required reports that this is actually a potential risk for them, then that is a problem. And the board had a blind spot and didn't recognize that this is a problem, that this wasn't being reported as a material risk. So it's those types of things where we see the need. But I like to focus as well really on the upside, that the board needs to be there to ask questions about, are we treating this as an opportunity? Are we investing the appropriate capital in this? If the board's not involved, well, and the board is just looking to manage solely to the financial bottom line, the board may be putting in pressures on the executives to come back with short-term returns where they're not investing against the business opportunities and risk related to climate change, as another example of like board blinkers on and needing to really understand these issues, which isn't to say, this is a question I get, that you need to have like a climate scientist on your board, but you do need to have somebody who understands what kinds of challenges and opportunities this issue provides for your business, and you do need to provide training to everyone on it.
Professor, for companies still lacking in ESG expertise, what advice would you offer to boards looking to enhance their knowledge and capabilities in this critical area?
So there are a number of training programs available for board members around sustainability. In this country, we have the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD. There's a global program called Competent Boards. Different universities have executive education programs for board members. I run, for example, an online executive education program that isn't for boards directly, but I have board members take it because it's relevant for them on the strategy and business case side of things. So I think important for the nominating committee of the board to work with the executive leadership team to come up with understanding which material issues the board should get trained in. And then with that training, I also think the board should look closely from a nominating perspective at whether or not there are a couple of material areas where they really need somebody with expertise. But again, if they need expertise in climate, they also, as with any other board member, would be looking for a number of things, right? They want somebody who really understands how to run an organization, somebody who really understands the business imperative. If it's a global company, somebody has global experience. There's other things that they're looking for. And so, I'd look, for example, at a chief sustainability officer from another company, or I'd look at somebody who's run a global nonprofit organization that's focused on climate change and works with business, right? Because they have the global experience, they know how to run things, they know the challenges, and they also bring the climate experience to it. Somebody who's been on the board of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and actively involved in some of their initiatives, right? So it's that kind of like, as I look for a board member, I have a variety and I incorporate this into the search, right? So if I really know I really need an investor, great. Let's see if we can find an investor who also has sustainability background or climate investment background. And the final thing I would say on this front is don't tokenize this, right? So in this country, in the United States, sometimes people say, all right, yeah, of course we should have more diversity. So let's put a woman on the board. And now that woman is supposed to be responsible for representing all women on this board of otherwise men, right? That's not a reasonable expectation. And similarly, putting one person on the board who cares about sustainability, if nobody else does, is also not, that's setting up a failure for the person. So you want to think through a full strategy of educating everyone on the board, of creating a committee where this person can play a significant role, bringing in a couple of other board members who are passionate about it, even if they have less expertise, but are going to be supportive. And probably you have more than one board member. And I'll give you an example of a pretty dramatic shift. So McKesson, which is a drug company here in this country, was unfortunately very involved in creating the opioid crisis we have here. So they were successfully sued by a number of states and others around them overselling opioids to people to create addiction. When you look at their board back when they were doing that behavior, there was not one person on the board who had any kind of sustainability expertise, whether it was ethics or governance or environmental or social or anything. They didn't have an ESG committee either. If you look today, after the crisis, they have 7 or 8 board members with ESG credentials, a couple with social, a couple with environmental, a couple with governance, right? So they've recognized that they actually need board oversight to ask the right questions around these topics to avoid a black swan event like we saw with this opioid crisis. So I think we do, unfortunately, human nature is such that often this happens after a big risk event. But I do think we're seeing, hopefully, more companies recognizing they need to be proactive about this.
Thank you, Professor Whelan, for joining us today for this insightful episode. Your extensive experience from your leadership at the Rainforest Alliance to your pioneering work at NYU Stern has provided us with invaluable perspectives on the evolving role of boards in addressing ESG issues. Thank you once again, Professor Whelan, for being with us today. We look forward to following your continued efforts to drive the change in the world of business and sustainability.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking with you, and I'm hope that your listeners go to our website and look up all the research that we've been doing and find it useful to them. Thank you again.